Well, welcome tonight to the first ever Fireside Chat with the founders. We're really excited to have these two gentlemen here today. They've been instrumental to the success and growth of this organization. And I think also Lisa and I feel like they've been so important to us also as mentors and advisors over the years. So I really want to thank you guys for, taking the time to be here tonight, but also for all of the contributions you've made to Riverkeeper and the support you've given to Lisa and I as well. As you all know, we've been celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. It's been a lot of fun reflecting on all of the different issues and events throughout the years. And even though it's been 25 years, there was a group of people that got started on this project of starting a Riverkeeper well before 25 years ago. We always think of our anniversary as December 19th, 1999, when we were officially given our license to be a Waterkeeper program. But this work started well before 1999. So Ben and Quinn, I'm here tonight. I'm really excited to have you guys share some of your insights into those early years, but also insights in memories and reflections on 25 years. But I first want to give you the opportunity, you guys, to talk a little bit, introduce yourself, your background, and really like to hear more about why you guys got involved in the beginning or how you got involved with this group of people that was trying to found this organization. You want to go first, Ben?
I'm deferring to
All right.
I was. I know a lot of you in the room. I'm Quinton White. I'm professor of biology and marine science here at JU. Retired a couple of years ago after having spent 48 years on the faculty here. One of the better things I did was create this institute, and the building and the Riverkeeper organization has been part of that from the beginning of the institute. When I first got to JU, it was sort of hard not to notice the river and get involved in what was happening with the river. And so I've sort of spent my career looking at the St. Johns River, and in particular looking at the human impact on the St. Johns River. And so one of the frustrations that I had felt as I went along was, and we may talk about this a little bit more later, that the river didn't really have a good advocate. There was nobody speaking for the river. There was no organization. And what tended to happen was that you'd have something happen. One of the things that happened fairly early on was there was a guy named Homer Smith that wanted to build a scallop processing plant down in 9 Mile Creek.
Trout Creek.
Trout Creek. They go together, so they're not far apart. At any rate, and it was appalling to think that wanted to come in and dump raw scallop waste into the river and what that might have done. And there was an organization that got started for that, and there was another organization called Stewards of St. John's, and they would sort of pop up and they would fight something, and then they would just sort of dissipate. And so when the opportunity came along to become part of something that was going to tackle the entire river, it was something I was very much interested in. And so that's sort of where it started.
All right, I'm Ben Williams, and unlike Quinton, I have no education. Other than probably...
Ben has a huge education, but he got it from the river.
Instead of looking at it, on it, and in it. And I used to commercial fish, and we were in the seafood business for 35 years. And I probably have more hours at night on that river, gigging flounder, catching shrimp, catching alligators, than people that'll tell you they fish a lot on that river have. Okay, so that's how much time we've spent out there, and we've lived on the river for over 35 years. And when you're out there and when you're making a living for something, and when what you're doing is going to pay for your children's education and their clothes and their health care, and when you're in a culture, in the commercial fishing and the recreational fishing industry are a culture. They were a culture. There's still a little bit of all that left. You quickly understand that you have to work to protect the thing that it is that all that depends on, and that was the river. So we long time ago, started working on various things. The first thing I really ever went to that was sort of kind of river related, the city of Jacksonville wanted to put the southeast landfill at the headwaters of Durbin Creek. Rode to Tallahassee with the folks from the Sierra Club and I forget who all else, Sarah Bailey. Nobody's in here old enough to remember Sarah Bailey. She's still alive. She's 90 something. Sarah Bailey's a hero. But in any event, from there, like Quinton said, things would come up. The Homer Smith plant would come up, and Tom Beal and John Adsfit, stewards of the River Systems Preservation Society, and they went to work on that. And then stewards of the St. Johns, and St. Johns County actually talked about putting together an aquatic preserve committee. And this was when Rivertown, back then it was called Riverton, and there was nothing down there, whereas now there is. So all of these things exactly like Quint, and we were involved in these things, and it was always piecemeal, and it always wasn't encompassing enough, and it wasn't solid. And so when Riverkeeper showed up, yeah, it looked like it would deal with the bigger issue.
So you've touched on why you guys got involved, and that kind of also leads into why the other founders felt like there was a need for Riverkeeper at the time. But what was the conditions in the river? What were you seeing? Were there other problems that were going unaddressed, and how was this Riverkeeper why was this Riverkeeper program more important than some of the other smaller organizations that already existed?
Start.
No.
We had been real concerned over the amount of upland development, particularly in the headwaters, and in particularly the dredging and filling of wetlands that was going on. And we were seeing, understand this is 35, 40 years ago, we will continue to see a degradation of water quality in the river. We didn't really have algae blooms then, and you've got to understand that there's a whole lot less people in the area then than there are now. In fact, I think Jacksonville has something like 250,000 people when I moved to town, and now it's over 1 million. So we've seen that kind of growth in almost 50 years. And so we saw a lot of pressure happening to the river. And we saw this growth continuing, and you realize that the river was not getting any healthier. There had been some issues before I got to Jacksonville where there had been water hyacinths across the river because of the nutrients and water hyacinths have been released. Right across the street here, across the river, we had a sewage treatment plant that was dumping something like 13 million gallons of raw, untreated sewage a day into the river. And we were sort of appalled at that. In fact, when I first got to JU, Mayor then Hans Tansler had water skied in the river. Mm-hmm. And the thought was that if you water ski in the river, you had a good chance of picking up about 6 or 8 communicable diseases that you might get. But the city, to their credit, had gone in and wrapped up all those untreated sewage and was discharging now treated sewage. Of course, now we got over 25 million gallons of treated sewage going into the river and all those nutrients. You also had all the problems of south of us with all of the things that were happening with agriculture. And so runoff and sedimentation and turbidity and things like that were pretty much unchecked. The agencies really were not doing the job they were supposed to do. A lot of us were very frustrated with them, and we would argue with them and fight with them, but to no avail. Because frankly, they were dealing with the laws they had to enforce, and the laws were pretty lax. So there was a lot of politicking going on, a lot of people upset, and there was no base organization to sort of take care of all of that.
And picking up on what Quinton said about the agencies, there are people within the agencies that want to do, if you go talk to the scientists, you go talk to the regulators at St. Johns River Water Management District, and I have a lot of interaction with them because I do land management reviews with the Water Management District, Fish and Wildlife Commission, Florida Forest Service, Park Service, been doing that for about 15 years. So we have a lot of interaction with these people. They want the same thing we're all talking about in here, whether it's the river or whether it's these other environmental goods. There was they didn't have political support. And I know we're not a political organization, but they didn't have a big organization that would back them up. They didn't have somebody coming down there and sort of supporting if the regulator wanted to do something. And that was really important. And going back to what Quinton said about the condition of the river, going back even further than Quinton did, you know, the river was down here. And then they worked on it. We worked on it. All right, I was a kid. They worked on it. And it got better and better and better. And then it plateaued. And then we could see it tailing off again. Well, when you see something that you know is bad, that's been worked on, that's gotten better and better and better and plateaued, and all of a sudden you see it tailing off, that's really a bad sign, because you've already proved that you can fix the problem. You've already demonstrated that as a community you believe it's important and valuable. And the organizations that were there were not getting that job done. And so the impetus was, we really got to fight, because we've done so much. We can't go this way. We got to keep going this way. And that was the idea, to keep going up.
I'll actually pass around a few of these. I think it's interesting to see the headlines on these. I'll pass these around and you can take a look. These are from 1997, so it'll give you an indication of what the river conditions were. It was really a river that was, as these guys mentioned, in decline. And there was a real need for an organization that would hold the agencies accountable.
Those are called newspapers, by the way. People used to read those.
Yeah, exactly. And matter of fact, when we get done tonight, if you want, I put out a few of these binders that have newspaper articles. That was back when we had newspapers and we could clip newspaper articles. And we kept those for years until the last probably 5 years or so, when there's really not any articles to clip, unfortunately. But it is interesting to look back. Feel free to look through those. Those are from some of the early years. What guys, I know, like, one thing I'll tell everybody too is that one of the founders, and we're going to get to him in a minute, Roger Bass, who was instrumental to all of this. When he left the board in 2006, he wrote a history of the organization up to that point. And it's really interesting. We were reading that, getting ready for this, and reminiscing about what it was like at the beginning. And there was some challenges that the organization faced getting off the ground. We're fortunate, frankly, to these guys and to the other founders that we're actually here meeting today, because it almost didn't happen. Do y'all want to tell a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced in getting the organization going and prioritizing issues?
Okay. Carol Matthews, who was a marine biology teacher at Bowles at the time, had become president or chairman of Stewards of the St. John's.
Yeah.
And Roger had invited her to meet with some people down at Marineland at the Whitney Lab. There was a scientist down there named Rick Gleason who was also involved. And Carol had called me up and said, you want to go down and meet with this group? I said, sure. So we actually rode down together. And this was the first sort of get together that I became aware of what the Riverkeeper organization was and what was going on. Some of the people there included Ted and Leslie Turner. This is Ted Turner's son. And they were living in Jacksonville at the time. They had been very much involved in the Riverkeeper organization, particularly in Atlanta. And then Carol was there, Rick was there, Roger was there. And so it was sort of an interesting conversation about what the Riverkeeper organization was and what they were doing in other places. There was a Hudson Riverkeeper. Robert Kennedy Jr. had written a book about it. And so this is sort of where I got introduced to it. And I was a little naive about the whole thing. And we were riding back to Jacksonville. Carol said, well, what do you think about Teddy Turner? And I went, Teddy Turner? I hadn't realized that was Teddy Turner I was sitting next to, because everything was going on. So, but that was sort of the way we started, was meeting. And then the decision was made to then try to get a bigger group together with more people. And then we had some other organizational meetings. So we spent a lot of time sort of trying out things and talking about things and trying to get things going. We'll talk, Ben already mentioned Sarah Bailey. I was going through thinking about, we have said so many people be supportive of this organization over the years that contributed in so many countless ways. And I thought today, it takes a village. It's taken so many people so long, and we're so fortunate that people like Roger Bass were persistent enough and kept plugging away and putting it and making it happen. And so there was a lot of controversy too.
Well, and so Quinton mentions Roger. One of the things Roger did was he called up, all right, and I'm sure he called everybody. He called me up. He says, Ben, go get this book and read it. And the Riverkeepers, John Crone and Bobby Kennedy Jr. And so I went and got it. And I've still got 2 copies on the shelf. I've actually loaned them to people every now and then, even though it's 30 years old now, the book is.
Probably 40. Yeah.
It's old. But as I read it, I thought, oh, hell yes. Because it was like a blueprint in there, right? We had to go to bat for this thing. And so Roger, he found something, he looked at the process, and then he went in there and he pushed. And there were, and one other thing, and I don't know if y'all caught on, but biology teacher at Bowles School, this guy, Rick Gleason, Whitney Lab, you see the science attached to this? It was obvious to me as a non-scientist and to others of us that were non-scientists from the beginning that this is how we needed to do this. We needed to do it with science. And so it has always been, every time an issue gets addressed, it's like, okay, let's check the science. Let's make sure we have the science right. Let's spend the money on the science to be sure it's right. And that's a big deal. I mean, for a non-scientist to go in there and see these people with all those letters after the names, whatever the heck they mean, that's encouraging. That means you've got the brains.
Yeah, well, but one of the things, and Ben points out this, one of the things that happened with all these organizations that popped up was they were very much enthusiastic, they were passionate, but they always didn't have their facts right. And so that became a problem. And one of the things we talked about early on was we wanted to make sure we had data. We wanted to be able to support what we were saying. This may have been the scientists in us. But we wanted to be passionate, but we didn't want that to be the emotional argument. Oh, you can't do that because it's in my backyard. Because most of the people who opposed the Homer Smith plant were in that area. Mm-hmm. And there were others of us that said, wait a minute, that makes no sense because you've got all these problems with all these things coming off the effluent coming out of that plant. And so we were able to argue the science and defeat it. And they were very upset with us, which is good.
One thing I want to touch on real quick, though, is I know there was 2 different kind of factions that came to the table that almost derailed things. Can you all touch on that real quick? Because I think it's important. It's interesting that it's an issue that we're still involved with to this day, or that we weren't, or we tried to avoid at that time.
Well, I mean, it's Rodman.
Yeah.
It's the Ocklawaha. And it was agreed to begin with that we had so many things to deal with on the main stem of the river that we could work for years and years and years, and we could bring everybody into the table, and we could be doing good things, and FDE was going to keep working on the Florida Defenders of the Environment, was going to continue to work on the Ocklawaha. Now, I'm going to stop there out of deference to Lisa because, all right, little pontification. In my world, in a peaceful democratic society, it's very important how you do a thing, right? It's not so much that you accomplish the thing sometimes, but that you bring everybody along and you do it peacefully and kindly with rational, reasonable arguments and leave everybody as whole as possible when it's all done, right? And in my opinion, forgive me, we would have Rodman solved now if we'd have taken that approach a little bit more aggressively. If we'd have done it a little bit at a time and brought the fishermen along. But that doesn't change the fact that ultimately that dam's coming down and ultimately that river needs to be reconnected to the St. John's exactly the way it does. The problem is how we've tried to do it. I'm going to get yelled at later, aren't I?
But early on.
But we had bass fishermen come to come to the meeting, right? We had the head of Save Rodman come. He only came to one. But we had head of the Florida Bass Federation come. And if you're going to save something like this, and the fishermen are users of the thing, they should be advocates for it. Obviously, I'm an advocate for it, and I'm not smarter than they are. And so, yeah, we were trying to get everybody in the tent, and let's get to work on the big issue, and let's put the one thing that's going to be a huge thorn aside. And they did a really good job of that.
Well, I think in reading Roger's history, because obviously I wasn't there, you guys were, but the Florida Definitive Environment came to the meetings with their agenda was to restore alkali. That was the primary focus. Of course, the bass fishermen came and their primary agenda was to keep the dam in place. And so it really created a lot of friction within the group initially. And I always remember the headline that was in the Times Union that said, Riverkeeper program headed for the rocks. Because it was literally, the organization was splintering. And I think that goes back to Roger Bass, who was the chairman of the organization at the time, who really had the foresight to say, guys, we're going to put this issue aside and we're going to focus on, like you said, all of these other issues. And what ended up happening is we came back and revisited this issue probably about 5 or 6 years later. But at the time, I think it was a smart decision.
Yeah, well, understand that at the time there was a group that wanted, and they were out of Gainesville, and Richard Heyman, who was a University of Florida law professor, was involved, and we also had some legal advice going on. And so there was a lot of interest in the Rodman Dam and what had happened. But we also had understood that we had a 310-mile long river that was a massive project, and it was going to be very, very difficult to tackle the entire river at one time. Mm-hmm. And so we sort of made a decision, because we were Jacksonville based, that we would focus on the lower St. Johns River. And so we could say with pretty clear conscience, all right, we're going to not address the Rodman. Well, now that we've watched the changes that have happened in the river over the years, and the harbor deepening and the development, everything that's happened, it's time to remove the dam. And so, we want to we got the science here tonight, reunite the rivers, because the science supports it. And I said 35, 40 years ago when I first got here, yeah, the Rodman's a productive system because it's a brand new system. But what's going to happen is it's going to slowly decline as things accumulate. And that's what's happened.
Exactly.
And if you look at our history as a country and as the world, back in the 50s and 60s, we built dams all over the place. We dammed rivers up and down all these rivers, up and down the world, around the world. And now, because they're reaching the end of their natural life, engineering-wise, you're either having to take them down or spend millions and millions and millions of dollars restoring them. It makes more sense to take them down, and so we're now removing like 2,000 dams a year around the world. So it's time to reunite the rivers, and it's time for the Riverkeeper to take on that challenge. But I'm gonna go back, because I don't want Roger Bass to be left out too much of the discussion. Yeah, we owe a huge amount of debt to Roger for making this all happen.
Absolutely. And let's touch on him again in just a minute, but I'm going to pause here, and if anybody has any questions up to this point, love to have you throw them out.
Were there other river keepers around the United States that were being used as a model?
Mm-hmm. Yes. At the time, we were...
I think it was 14 at the time.
Yeah, 14. I think we got out, we were like number 19 or something. I can't remember the exact number. Now there's several hundred around the world. What was interesting about that was, in many cases, the Riverkeeper had been an individual that got started, and they built an organization around it. In our case, we had an organization that then went out and found a Riverkeeper, which in itself was a bit of a struggle initially. And so, yes, there were other Riverkeepers to model, and the Hudson Riverkeeper was sort of the model that had been sort of put out there by the book and things like that.
And it's worth reading that book, because there's some places in there where John Cronin was an old fisherman, right? And Bobby Kinney, of course, an environmental lawyer. And Cronin literally would pull up and say, I'm the Hudson Riverkeeper. And people had no idea what that meant, but he said it with authority.
Right.
And it had an effect. It is well worth reading. It almost reads like a novel.
Yeah, he tells a story in the book about pulling up to this giant tanker that's just pumping bilge water into the river, and sort of says over his loudspeaker or the radio that, I'm John Cronin, Hudson Riverkeeper, and you're in violation of federal water standards.
Right.
And Captain Kimming said, "What the heck? What's going on?" So,
And that the Waterkeeper model, it started on the Hudson, as these guys mentioned. It was a situation there too where their historic fisheries were in decline, and so it was actually started by a group of commercial fishermen and recreational fishermen that came together. This Riverkeeper was hired. It was a new concept. It was a new concept in the United States. There was actually river keepers in Europe in the Middle Ages that would be hired to protect private trout streams, to keep people from poaching. And so this kind of idea of having this person who watched out over the river and helped to protect it, and they actually then used legal means to do a pretty darn good job of cleaning up the Hudson. And so that was the model. And it's really spread, as Quint mentioned, there's over, I think, 350 Waterkeeper programs and affiliate organizations all around the world now.
Was there only one Riverkeeper before Lisa?
Lisa's the third Riverkeeper. Mike Collingsworth was the first, and then the second was Neil Armington. I got a few more here.
I heard a story from some real full-time Riverkeeper guys about Bob Kennedy coming up to a meeting at somebody's house in Riverside.
Well, the first oyster roast was actually held at Bruce and Susan Smather's house. So if y'all are familiar with our annual oyster roast, the first one was actually held at their home, and Bobby Kennedy, who was the president of the Waterkeeper Alliance at the time, came down to help the organization get off the ground and get started. So that was a cool moment. And of course, now the oyster roast has grown to be an event, that's 700 people that attend. So really neat. All right, I'm going to jump back in here real quick. I do want to touch one more real quickly again on Roger Bass, because while he couldn't be here tonight, he lives in North Carolina now. I really think that what Roger brought to this organization is really a testament of what has made this organization last and has been so successful. It's the tenacity and the commitment and never giving up, and of course leadership. Do y'all want to say anything about Roger real quick before we go on?
He never gave up. That was a big thing.
Yeah.
And he, whatever the rest of us did, and I did less than a lot of people, because we had a lot of people with that. We were very fortunate in that the people that were willing to be on the Riverkeeper board and were helping, we had folks that were MIT trained executives, and they would come in and be part of the board. That was Dale Lewis.
Yeah.
I mean, we had some really, really good people in there, and we're very fortunate. But part of the reason we got those really good people in there is that Roger was a bulldog and made the organization be set up correctly to begin with, and made it be focused. And that's a big deal.
Yeah. And we had some people. Lenore McCullough was a PhD chemist, married to a local physician, had been active in Audubon, active in shelling organizations, and there was another one, pulling a blank now. But we had all these people that were coming and going and going through things. And I think about, there was a woman named Beverly Fleming who was a park naturalist, I think, for St. Johns County, yep. But she had written articles for the St. Augustine Record and Mandarin News, which I think was a paper at the time. And there were people that came in and contributed and made things happen. But Roger was the glue and the force that just kept plugging away. When some of us would get busy doing something else, Roger was always sort of pushing it along and making it happen. And we owe a huge gratitude to Roger. Because I don't think we'd be here today if Roger hadn't been so persistent.
Well, an interesting story too is that Roger, the way that the Turners got involved is Teddy Turner, actually, he was a sailor and he had a boat. Roger was a surveyor. So he went out and surveyed his boat. Well, while I was there, of course, Roger, was going to make sure he mentioned that, hey, we're trying to start this Riverkeeper organization. We really need you to be involved. So he sent them a letter after he met with them, and it just coincidentally happened that right around the same time, Bobby Kennedy had called the Turners because he knew they had been involved with the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper in Atlanta, and said, "Hey, can you all help get an organization started in the St. Johns?" So that's when Leslie Turner called Roger, and then of course she joined the board, and they gave an instrumental first gift, financial gift, that really got the organization off the ground, because I don't think with some of that initial financial support, it would have been really tough to keep the organization going and to actually hire a riverkeeper.
Yeah. One of the things that we struggled with initially was money, obviously. And Roger had gotten the impression that the Turner Foundation would support us for a period of time. They didn't share that view. And so they did not give us a lot of money, give us some startup money, but it sort of ended there. And that's where people stepped up and started contributing, and you saw things begin to roll together. River Branch Foundation, which is a Johnson & Johnson spinoff, has been very supportive. Some other people had been involved, the Healy Foundation. I'm trying to think, we've had some very, very good support for a long time that's added to the stability of the organization and gotten it to where it is today.
I'm going to ask one more question about just the challenges getting started, then I want to move on to some of the things that y'all observations of the river. But tell a little bit about the challenges of hiring your first riverkeeper, because I know that.
No, I don't want to relive that.
Yeah. We had some ideas about how we were going to do things, and one of the concepts we had at the time was we knew we wanted somebody that could analyze data and make presentations to people. So we had this concept that we would actually give them a case study and then let them make a presentation to the board about the case study. And we ended up hiring somebody out of Atlanta. At least we thought we hired them. But then circumstances came along, and initially they couldn't come because their mother was sick or they had to finish a degree, and it was like one thing after another. And we finally reached a point where we said, "I'm sorry, either you take it or we got to move on." And they said, "Well, we can't take it," so we moved on. And then we were fortunate in some ways to find Mike Hollingsworth, who at the time was working with DEP, was willing to take on the project. And even then we had to wait a month because Mike had a bunch of projects he felt like he had to wrap up for DEP before he came over to us. And Mike was the first riverkeeper for a number of years, and then we sort of outgrew Mike, I'll use that phrase, and we needed somebody who was a little bit more dynamic, and that's where Neil Amerjant came along.
Anything to add? Or?
Well, I mean, the word dynamic, shall we say aggressive and abrasive, Neil was a hard charger, and there was always the next thing that needed to be done. Now, I don't know how many times we had the discussion, him and I, after something, because he's all worked up and something would have just had been accomplished. But he's all worked up about the next thing, which is really great. But, you know, as environmentalists, we need to every now and then take a breath and look at what we've accomplished. Look at all the things that have been brought back. Look at all the good, because you need to be happy warriors in life, right? You can't be bitter and ugly about what's not done all the time and never focus on your wins. And so anyway, Neil was very aggressive, and we needed that at that point. We were ready to go from someone that had worked in an agency and was kind of a get-along, and I'm not saying that in a bad way, but Neil was a head-butter, and we needed a head-butter at that point.
Well, Mike had brought the science and began getting the science put together. And then Neil came along, and Neil was a more aggressive, because we thought that was the time for that. And when it came time for Neil to move on, we made a decision that we needed somebody with more government experience and policy experience, but still was aggressive. And this is where Lisa came in. So this was all done consciously by the board, trying to think through what was best for the organization.
One thing I love is reading about hiring Neil, and one of the questions Neil posed to Roger early on is, "Who are your enemies?" And Roger said, "We don't have any enemies." He said, "You will when I'm done." So, okay, guys. So after more than 25 years of watching the river, seeing changes, watching this organization grow, why is Riverkeeper still important? Why are we still relevant?
we still have the same issues. Growth, pollution. People are still attacking the river, and it's death by 1,000 cuts. And so we're always trying to patch those cuts. And be it, discharge, be it dredging, be it manatees, be it overfishing, be it the Rodman, there's always a project. And we're only still focusing on the lower and to some extent the middle basin. We haven't even touched the upper basin yet.
From a slightly different perspective, and there was a meeting in the Times-Union building one day, and they were going to write a series of articles, and the question got asked, and I would pose it now again, not the question, but the answer, and the answer is because it still actually functions, right? Yeah. It's still fishable, it's still swimmable, it still produces huge numbers of shrimp. It still provides recreation that is valuable when you talk about bringing businesses here. The value of a house that is on that river that's fishable and swimmable, the tax dollars that goes to the city so that other places don't have to be taxed quite so much. I mean, it is an asset that is valuable to the community culturally and economically. And if we will protect it, it will continue to do what it's done for however long, way back before we all were here, for the community. And so, yeah, all the things Quinton said, because all those things still need to be done, but they all need to be done so that can all continue. That's what you're trying to do.
Yeah, it's been a balancing act because we have worked hard to try to clean up the river and to reduce the amount of pollution going into the river. At the same time, the number of people in the area have continued to grow. And this is the balancing act we got. I'm always amazed at how resilient the river is when we consider how much we've used and abused it over the years. It really is a remarkable ecosystem. And I've oftentimes said, about the time I understand what's going on, something happened, you scratch your head and say, why'd that happen? So
We're gonna wrap this up soon and open it up for some more questions. But so tell us if you have any observations as we close, like on what you've seen change in the river, good or bad, and what you see for the future. What's the future hold for the St. John's?
I think the fact that we've got to continue to recognize that the river is extremely important. Jacksonville is here because of the river. And people love the river. I mean, I'm not sure I've ever met somebody who just, we need to pave the whole thing over, even though but people don't think that their little piece of change makes a difference. And yes, it does. And that's where when I see a particular development where they're filling wetlands or they're putting in a bulkhead, I don't want to be like South Florida where it's all concrete bulkhead. I appreciate the salt marsh, and I hope that we'll continue to support the river and support the Riverkeeper because there's still challenges out there. We're still dredging the river. The port's an economic engine for Jacksonville. But you start in the late 1800s, every 10 to 15 years, we've deepened the river. Mm-hmm. And we just deepened it to 47 feet. Well, folks, my prediction in 10 to 15 years, they're going to come back and say, we got to go to 50. Because why? The Panama Canal is 50 feet now, so you got to get the ships in here and out. And that requires maintenance dredging, and we got to put that stuff someplace, and they want to put it on the wetlands because that's the cheapest place to do it. So it's a balancing act, and we're not winning, but we're not losing either.
All right, so a couple other challenges that I see in addition to what Quinton mentioned. And we had these discussions at board meetings, right? And it's St. John's Riverkeeper, and any board, any organization, 310 miles, how the heck are you going to do all of that? We're still doing, working up here. But if you don't protect the land, you can't protect the water. If you don't go out there and do land conservation, if you're, that's one of the reasons Luann and I are real big on supporting the North Florida Land Trust and Alachua Conservation Trust and the O2O Corridor and the Florida Corridor Foundation. You got to support that. because we have to go buy those sensitive lands. We have to buy the recharge areas. We have to buy the wetlands around the creeks and the like. All right, so that's one challenge, is we have to think bigger than the river, because the bigger is part of the river. The other challenge is Quinton mentioned that we have basically 4 times the number of people here. We have a challenge of access to the river, because and I say that because the number of public docks, places for a mother to take a couple of small children on a beautiful spring morning with their little rods and potentially catch a fish out of this river we've worked to make the water clean enough where if they want to take it home, they eat it. We do not have 4 times as much public access to that river as we had back then, even with 4 times as many people. And mind you, we live on the river, and I would love it if I never had to see another sea-doo again, if I didn't have to see another water skier or a rah-rah boat, the folks that run up and down the river and they want you to think how cool they are because of how fast they're going, because I'm a fisherman. But they own that just like I do. And to make people love something and make people work to protect something, they have to be able, and it says it on the book we put together, get your feet wet. They got to be able to get out there and use what they own. We all own it collectively. And so that's a challenge, to maintain that access. And another challenge, and I see 3 or 4 of them, my daughter is holding one of them right there. A lot of the kids nowadays, and we had some folks from the Coggin School of Business out to our farm, and long story, I'm not going to go into it, but I told them the same thing. It says, you're out here, it's a beautiful day, you're out in the woods, we're talking about the environment, we're talking about sustainable forestry and all these things. And I see this, right? And we are raising a fair portion of the next generation that they don't want to be hot, they don't want to be cold, they don't want to be bitten by a bug, they don't know that they can be enthused and excited and happy out there immersed in this thing. And so yes, maybe they'll believe it like a religion that we should protect the river. But that's not the same as actually getting your hands on it. I see Soraya shaking her head. I've seen her in the water and she looks happy in the water. And so, that's another challenge. We have to get the kids out there. We have to get them wet. We have to let them go home with a little fish and cook it for dinner and eat it and make that connection. And they'll fight for that thing. And so that's a challenge.
Along those same lines, there's a project in Jacksonville right now supported by the Winston Foundation called Project One Health, which is trying hard to get kids to do less screen and more green.
Yeah.
And if you haven't been aware of it, strongly suggest you look into it. Project One Health. There's a pledge you can take to get off your computers and get off your phones. We're all guilty of it. And I worry a lot because there's some good science right now that it's impacting our children's brain development. Absolutely. And they need more time outdoors, enjoying the outdoors. And there's a book out there called The Nature Deficit Disorder that sort of talks about the fact we're not outdoors enough. And so get your kids outdoors and playing.
And we'll leave it there. And I'm going to make a plug there real quick to our education program, because that's one of the things that we prioritize is hands-on learning opportunities and getting kids out on the water and on boats, and take literally thousands of kids a year out on the St. John's to experience it, many of them for the first time from the water. And so it is really critical that we do. Well, guys, I want to wrap this up. And first, I want to thank you guys for coming tonight and for all your contributions over the years. We literally would not be here tonight if not for people like this that really had the foresight to get this organization started. Well,